And we welcome you back to America's Forum. I'm John Bachman alongside Miranda Kahn. And we also have the former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Pete Hoekstra, joining us here live. And now we're going to bring in Senator Mike Lee as promised. We're going to talk about his book here in just a moment. We're also going to talk about this deal with Iran and the lack of transparency, as some had suggested. Senator Lee, I wanted to ask you about Chuck Schumer. He has now weighed in and says he would like Congress to have more of a review role in this process. As we talked about with Pete, you need 13 Democrats in the U.S. Senate to come up with a veto-proof majority or to get something passed that would require some sort of congressional approval. I asked the same question to Pete, but what do you think? How many Democrats in the U.S. Senate right now would be willing to go along with something like this?
Well, I think it's close to 13. I don't know what the exact number is. I don't think anyone knows what the exact number is, but every day that passes makes it, I think, that much more likely that we're going to have a number closer to 13 among the Democrats who are likely to join with Republicans in saying, hey, look, this involves some very significant implications for the United States and for our allies around the world, especially for Israel. We need to be able to weigh in on this. And insofar as President Obama is trying to establish any kind of permanent policy, then Congress definitely needs to be involved.
Senator, you mentioned that you may get to 13 Democrats who will ally with the Republicans, but exactly what will they ally on? Will you think you'll get to a vote perhaps disapproving this arrangement, this agreement with Iran?
Yes, possibly. And one of the things that I would like to see would be to have 13 Democrats join with 54 Republicans in passing the Kirk-Menendez sanctions legislation. I think we need to ratchet sanctions up on Iran in order to avoid an armed conflict, and especially in order to avoid a nuclear-armed Iran. That's what needs to be avoided here, and we've got to do everything we can to prevent that from happening.
Senator, what would it take for you to approve a deal with Iran?
Well, I think it would have to be something that would advance rather than inhibit or curtail the national security interests of the United States. And of course, that is a broad statement, but the devil's going to be in the details. I'd have to see the deal before I could tell whether or not it's something I could support. But it would have to have a real impact on Iran's ongoing ability to develop nuclear weapons. We don't want to leave Iran with enough ability to enrich enough fissile material that they could reasonably put together enough material for a nuclear weapon. We can't have that happen. A nuclear-armed Iran would be bad. It would represent an existential threat not only to Israel, but quite potentially to the United States of America itself. And the concern is not just with what would happen if this bomb were actually detonated, but also what would happen if they just had it and there was the threat on the table of a possible detonation of such a bomb. We can't allow that to happen. We've got to do everything we can to stop it.
Also, another possible nuclear arms race in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia saying they're not sure, they won't comment on whether or not they will try to obtain a nuclear weapon. Senator, let me change gears a little bit and talk about 2016. We don't know much about this Iran deal in terms of what it would actually finally look like. We do expect to know about another presidential candidate today. Rand Paul expected to jump in the race. You've been a close ally of Ted Cruz. Which do you think of these two early candidates has the better inside track on the 2016 nomination?
You know, it's really too early to tell, and I have to say I've got three very close friends and allies in the Senate. Senators Cruz, Paul, and Rubio are all either in the race or about to get in. And I really like all three of them. All three offer something great that they bring to the table. So right now, in addition to watching the personalities and many of my favorite people in the Senate getting into the presidential race, I'm also looking at policy, at which one will be the best, the most aggressive, the most effective spokesperson for a conservative reform agenda, one that will help America's poor get out of poverty, one that will help America's middle class to get ahead, and to do so by harnessing the populist power of the conservative message, which is something we haven't done as well in recent years as we need to.
You know, you've got another friend, I'm assuming, that may get into this race as well, at least someone that's talking about it, fellow Senator Lindsey Graham. You know, where's foreign policy? I mean, you talked about Rubio, you talked about Cruz, and you talked about Rand Paul, but Lindsey also. I mean, they've got very different views on foreign policy. How's that going to play in this presidential nominating process and ultimately in the presidential race?
I think it'll be a very important part of the discussion, as it is every year, but I think it'll be especially important this year as we're facing some new, unique threats and challenges from parts of the world that cause us a lot of heartburn. And yeah, I think it's going to be a robust discussion. Look, at this point, I'm looking at this field that keeps growing, and my inclination is to say the more the merrier, because what we need is a robust, roiling debate about conservative principles, about how best to harness them, and about who is the best spokesperson for those policies.
Yeah, and Pete brings up a good point. There's a lot of different opinions in this group of potential contestants here in this race, and so that will provide a good debate, especially on these issues of foreign policy becoming so important in this discussion. We're going to be right back with Mike Lee, and I do promise we are going to talk about his book. I know he wants to get to that. And we're going to talk about these stacks of papers he has in his office. Maybe the senator has a little hoarding problem he wants to talk about, or maybe it's just the problem with Congress. We'll get to that when he talk about Senator Mike Lee's new book, out today, when we come right back here on America's Forum. And we welcome you back to America's Forum. I'm John Bachman, filling in for J.D. Hayworth again today.
And I'm Miranda Kahn. A new Rasmussen Reports poll is out on illegal immigration, and the results, well, probably won't surprise you. The poll finds that 62% believe the government is not aggressive enough when it comes to deporting illegal immigrants. Only 16% think the government is too aggressive.
Well, an overwhelming 83% of these voters polled think someone should be required to prove they are legally allowed here in the U.S. before receiving local, state, or government services. Just 12% disagree with that number, and there's a big shift in these numbers, too, changing. Let's continue our conversation now with Utah Senator Mike Lee. Also, former Congressman Pete Hoekstra is with us as well. Let's ask you about these numbers, Congressman, because this kind of ties us, or brings us to your book here. This is a change here. 62% believe the government is not being aggressive enough when it comes to deporting illegal immigrants. That's up 10 percentage points from just 1 year ago. Is this a comment on the immigration policy, or more specifically, the way it's being applied because of this president?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with the way it's being enforced, or the way that it's being not enforced. As I explain in the book, the president has enormous power. Especially when it comes to the way that the president chooses to implement or not implement a federal law. Congress has created a lot of the problem. It has made it worse by writing broad laws and then granting enormous discretion to the executive branch of government. And you mentioned a minute ago these two stacks of documents I have in my office in Washington. One stack is about 80,000 pages high. It stands about 11 feet tall. And it represents all the executive branch, bureaucratic regulations promulgated over the last year. Next to that is a separate stack of documents, just a few hundred pages high, of all the laws passed by Congress. Most of the laws, most of the real policy decisions are now being made by men and women who, however well-educated, hard-working, well-intentioned they may be, don't work for the people, because they're not accountable to the people, because they don't ever have to stand for election. So it's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, Our Lost Constitution, is to explain how it is that we need to return lawmaking to the lawmaking branch, which is Congress. And it all starts with individual voters voting differently and questioning their senators and their congressmen differently about how they would make laws, about how they would restore the lawmaking power to the legislative branch.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Mike. The real issue here is, watching the State of the Union speech back in January, the president got up and said, if Congress doesn't act, I will act unilaterally. And you had two branches of government acting unconstitutionally. The president saying, I'm going to take the authority, and you had a good portion of the Congress standing up and applauding the president for taking authority away from Congress. Does Congress actually have the will to take some of this authority and take back at the responsibility that you claim and the Constitution says that they should have?
Congress definitely has the obligation to do that. And a number of members of Congress on both sides of the Capitol and some in both political parties have the will to do it. Perhaps not quite enough right now. That's why we need more who feel this way. And again, one of the reasons I wrote this book is to share stories of instances in our history that show that we as a country, a couple of centuries ago, made a very specific decision not to have this kind of government. In my book, I tell the story about a prominent politician of the founding era, Alexander Hamilton, who almost sank his, up to that point, very promising political career by giving a speech at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, actually advocating for some type of monarchy. Now, he was able to overcome that, but just barely, by the skin of his teeth. And as I explain further in the book, it was clear that what the founding generation was afraid of was the concentration of power in the hands of the few, and especially in the hands of one person. That's why we don't have despots in this country. That's why we don't have a king. That's why we don't even have a president that can act on his own entirely by changing the law without Congress going along with it.
What do you hope readers get out of your book?
What I want readers to get out of my book is the fact that we have a number of provisions in our Constitution that have fallen into disrepair and disorder and neglect, but it's not too late to restore them. We can, and I believe we must, restore them. And the way I go about doing that is I tell the stories underlying each of these provisions of the Constitution that I focus on that have been lost. I tell the stories behind them. I also tell a different set of stories about how they've been lost, and then I talk about possible solutions of how they can be restored. So it really leaves the reader with a renewed sense of hope and an understanding and an appreciation of the great things we have in our Constitution and why we need to work to restore it.
Well, Senator Lee, there's no question things like the origination clause in the Constitution are incredibly important, but not all of us grew up the son of the Solicitor General of the U.S. In the United States here. So, how do you make people really care about this stuff? Because when a lot of Americans are worried about getting their kid to soccer practice, it can seem, a little dry and hard to understand.
Well, that's right. And that's why I've learned with my own children. That's why I've learned in talking about this with friends and with neighbors, with people across my state, that the best way to do that is by telling stories. If you put something in the form of a story, you can make even the most arcane subject interesting. And that's why I go back and I tell stories. I tell stories like the story about a man named John Wilkes, not to be confused with John Wilkes Booth, but a man named John Wilkes who lived in England about the time of the American Revolution, who was subject to abuses of government by the administration of King George III. He became famous throughout England and even in America because he stood up to the government. And it was John Wilkes and his writings that ended up inspiring an important part of our Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, that has in part been lost because of the way that we've focused on certain national security issues. And so I use that story to explain the meaning behind the Fourth Amendment and its history, and also to explain why it is that we need to restore it today.
What are the top 3, 4 things that come out of the book in terms of saying this is how we reestablish constitutional government and get back what we've lost?
Okay, so one of them has to do with the fact that Congress needs to start reinvigorating the Legislative Powers Clause. The very first clause of the first section of the first article of the Constitution says that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, most of our laws are now being made by the executive branch bureaucrats and not by those elected for 2- and 6-year terms to actually make the laws. So that needs to turn around, and it can turn around with a simple piece of legislation being passed called the REINS Act, of which I'm an original co-sponsor. The REINS Act would say that anytime one of these major rules comes out, one that has a significant impact on the American economy, it can't take effect until Congress affirmatively enacts it into law.
All right, well, Senator,
I also talk about the...
We'll have to leave that as a tease, and folks will want to read the book to get more of that information. The REINS Act, one of those things that I believe Ted Cruz and Rand Paul both agree on, so we'll have to find something else for that they don't agree on.
He's a fan.
We got the book up on the screen. You want to make sure you check it out. It's Our Lost Constitution by Senator Mike Lee. We thank him very much for being with us. You can get it online, available in bookstores as well today. Senator, thank you so much for your time.